物語の続きはホームページからお聞きいただけます。また、テキスト、MP3 ダウンロードも合わせてご利用ください。88thpp.com 88thpp.com
Chapter 44. In which are continued the unheard of adventures of the inn so loud, in fact, were the shouts of Don Quixote, that the landlord opening the gate of the inn in all haste, came out in dismay, and ran to see who was uttering such cries, and those who were outside joined him. Maritornes, who had been by this time roused up by the same outcry, suspecting what it was, ran to the loft and, without anyone seeing her, untied the halter by which Don Quixote was suspended, and down he came to the ground in the sight of the landlord and the travelers, who approaching asked him what was the matter with him that he shouted so. He without replying a word took the rope off his wrist, and rising to his feet leapt upon Rocinante, braced his buckler on his arm, put his lance in rest, and making a considerable circuit of the plain came back at a half-gallop exclaiming, "Whoever shall say that I have been enchanted with just cause, provided my lady the Princess Micomicona grants me permission to do so, I give him the lie, challenge him and defy him to single combat." The newly arrived travelers were amazed at the words of Don Quixote, but the landlord removed their surprise by telling them who he was, and not to mind him as he was out of his senses. They then asked the landlord if by any chance a youth of about 15 years of age had come to that inn, one dressed like a muleteer, and of such and such an appearance, describing that of Doña Clara's lover. The landlord replied that there were so many people in the inn he had not noticed the person they were inquiring for, but one of them observing the coach in which the judge had come, said, "He is here no doubt, for this is the coach he is following. Let one of us stay at the gate, and the rest go in to look for him, or indeed it would be as well if one of us went round the inn, lest he should escape over the wall of the yard." "So be it," said another, and while two of them went in, one remained at the gate and the other made the circuit of the inn, observing all which, the landlord was unable to conjecture for what reason they were taking all these precautions, though he understood they were looking for the youth whose description they had given him. It was by this time broad daylight, and for that reason, as well as in consequence of the noise Don Quixote had made, everybody was awakened up, but particularly Doña Clara and Dorothea, for they had been able to sleep but badly that night, the one from agitation at having her lover so near her, the other from curiosity to see him. Don Quixote, when he saw that not one of the four travelers took any notice of him or replied to his challenge, was furious and ready to die with indignation and wrath, and if he could have found in the ordinances of chivalry that it was lawful for a knight-errant to undertake or engage in another enterprise, when he had plighted his word and faith not to involve himself in any until he had made an end of the one to which he was pledged, he would have attacked the whole of them, and would have made them return an answer in spite of themselves. But considering that it would not become him nor be right, to begin any new emprise until he had established Micomicona in her kingdom, he was constrained to hold his peace and wait quietly to see what would be the upshot of the proceedings of those same travelers, one of whom found the youth they were seeking lying asleep by the side of a muleteer, without a thought of anyone coming in search of him, much less finding him. The man laid hold of him by the arm, saying, "It becomes you well indeed, Señor Don Luis, to be in the dress you wear, and well the bed in which I find you agrees with the luxury in which your mother reared you." The youth rubbed his sleepy eyes and stared for a while at him who held him, but presently recognized him as one of his father's servants, at which he was so taken aback that for some time he could not find or utter a word, while the servant went on to say, "There is nothing for it now, Señor Don Luis, but to submit quietly and return home, unless it is your wish that my lord, your father, should take his departure for the other world, for nothing else can be the consequence of the grief he is in at your absence." "But how did my father know that I had gone this road and in this dress?" said Don Luis. "It was a student to whom you confided your intentions," answered the servant, "that disclosed them. Touched with pity at the distress he saw your father suffer on missing you, he therefore dispatched 4 of his servants in quest of you, and here we all are at your service, better pleased than you can imagine that we shall return so soon and be able to restore you to those eyes that so yearn for you." "That shall be as I please, or as heaven orders," returned Don Luis. "What can you please or heaven order," said the other, "except to agree to go back? Anything else is impossible." All this conversation between the two was overheard by the muleteer at whose side Don Luis lay, and rising, he went to report what had taken place to Don Fernando, Cardenio, and the others, who had by this time dressed themselves, and told them how the man had addressed the youth as Don, and what words had passed, and how he wanted him to return to his father, which the youth was unwilling to do. With this, and what they already knew of the rare voice that heaven had bestowed upon him, they all felt very anxious to know more particularly who he was, and even to help him if it was attempted to employ force against him, so they hastened to where he was still talking and arguing with his servant. Dorothea at this instant came out of her room, followed by Doña Clara all in a tremor, and calling Cardenio aside, she told him in a few words the story of the musician and Doña Clara, and he at the same time told her what had happened, how his father's servants had come in search of him. But in telling her so, he did not speak low enough but that Doña Clara heard what he said, at which she was so much agitated that had not Dorothea hastened to support her she would have fallen to the ground. Cardenio then bade Dorothea return to her room, as he would endeavor to make the whole matter right, and they did as he desired. All the four who had come in quest of Don Luis had now come into the inn and surrounded him, urging him to return and console his father at once and without a moment's delay. He replied that he could not do so on any account until he had concluded some business in which his life, honor, and heart were at stake. The servants pressed him, saying that most certainly they would not return without him, and that they would take him away whether he liked it or not. "You shall not do that," replied Don Luis, "unless you take me dead, though however you take me, it will be without life." By this time most of those in the inn had been attracted by the dispute, but particularly Cardenio, Don Fernando, his companions, the judge, the curate, the barber and Don Quixote, for he now considered there was no necessity for mounting guard over the castle any longer. Cardenio, being already acquainted with the young man's story, asked the men who wanted to take him away, what object they had in seeking to carry off this youth against his will. "Our object," said one of the four, "is to save the life of his father, who is in danger of losing it through this gentleman's disappearance." Upon this Don Luis exclaimed, "There is no need to make my affairs public here. I am free, and I will return if I please, and if not, none of you shall compel me." "Reason will compel your worship," said the man, "and if it has no power over you, it has power over us, to make us do what we came for, and what it is our duty to do." "Let us hear what the whole affair is about," said the judge at this, but the man, who knew him as a neighbor of theirs, replied, "Do you not know this gentleman, Señor Judge? He is the son of your neighbor, who has run away from his father's house in a dress so unbecoming his rank, as your worship may perceive." The judge on this looked at him more carefully and recognized him, and embracing him said, "What folly is this, Señor Don Luis, or what can have been the cause that could have induced you to come here in this way, and in this dress, which so ill becomes your condition?" Tears came into the eyes of the young man, and he was unable to utter a word in reply to the judge, who told the four servants not to be uneasy, for all would be satisfactorily settled, and then taking Don Luis by the hand, he drew him aside and asked the reason of his having come there. But while he was questioning him they heard a loud outcry at the gate of the inn, the cause of which was that two of the guests who had passed the night there, seeing everybody busy about finding out what it was the four men wanted, had conceived the idea of going off without paying what they owed, but the landlord, who minded his own affairs more than other people's, caught them going out of the gate and demanded his reckoning, abusing them for their dishonesty with such language that he drove them to reply with their fists, and so they began to lay on him in such a style that the poor man was forced to cry out and call for help. The landlady and her daughter could see no one more free to give aid than Don Quixote, and to him the daughter said, "Sir Knight, by the virtue God has given you, help my poor father, for two wicked men are beating him to a mummy." To which Don Quixote very deliberately and phlegmatically replied, "Fair damsel, at the present moment your request is inopportune, for I am debarred from involving myself in any adventure until I have brought to a happy conclusion one to which my word has pledged me, but that which I can do for you is what I will now mention. Run and tell your father to stand his ground as well as he can in this battle, and on no account to allow himself to be vanquished, while I go and request permission of the princess my Comicona to enable me to succor him in his distress, and if she grants it, rest assured I will relieve him from it." "Sinner that I am," exclaimed Maritornes, who stood by, "before you have got your permission my master will be in the other world." "Give me leave, Señora, to obtain the permission I speak of," returned Don Quixote, "and if I get it, it will matter very little if he is in the other world, for I will rescue him thence in spite of all the same world can do, or at any rate I will give you such a revenge over those who shall have sent him there that you will be more than moderately satisfied." And without saying anything more he went and knelt before Dorothea, requesting her highness in knightly and errant phrase to be pleased to grant him permission to aid and succor the castellan of that castle, who now stood in grievous jeopardy. The princess granted it graciously, and he at once, bracing his buckler on his arm and drawing his sword, hastened to the inn gate, where the two guests were still handling the landlord roughly, but as soon as he reached the spot he stopped short and stood still, though Maritornes and the landlady asked him why he hesitated to help their master and husband. "I hesitate," said Don Quixote, "because it is not lawful for me to draw sword against persons of squirely condition, but call my squire Sancho to me, for this defense and vengeance are his affair and business." Thus matters stood at the inn gate, where there was a very lively exchange of fisticuffs and punches, to the sword damage of the landlord and to the wrath of Maritornes, the landlady, and her daughter, who were furious when they saw the pusillanimity of Don Quixote, and the hard treatment their master, husband and father was undergoing. But let us leave him there, for he will surely find someone to help him, and if not, let him suffer and hold his tongue who attempts more than his strength allows him to do. And let us go back 50 paces to see what Don Luis said in reply to the judge whom we left questioning him privately as to his reasons for coming on foot and so meanly dressed. To which the youth, pressing his hand in a way that showed his heart was troubled by some great sorrow, and shedding a flood of tears, made answer. Senor, I have no more to tell you than that from the moment when, through heaven's will and our being near neighbors, I first saw Doña Clara, your daughter and my lady, from that instant I made her the mistress of my will, and if yours, my true lord and father, offers no impediment, this very day she shall become my wife. For her I left my father's house, and for her I assumed this disguise, to follow her whithersoever she may go, as the arrow seeks its mark or the sailor the pole star. She knows nothing more of my passion than what she may have learned from having sometimes seen from a distance that my eyes were filled with tears. You know already, Senor, the wealth and noble birth of my parents, and that I am their sole heir. If this be a sufficient inducement for you to venture to make me completely happy, accept me at once as your son, for if my father, influenced by other objects of his own, should disapprove of this happiness I have sought for myself, time has more power to alter and change things, than human will. With this the love-smitten youth was silent, while the judge, after hearing him, was astonished, perplexed, and surprised, as well at the manner and intelligence with which Don Luis had confessed the secret of his heart, as at the position in which he found himself, not knowing what course to take in a matter so sudden and unexpected. All the answer, therefore, he gave him was to bid him to make his mind easy for the present, and arrange with his servants not to take him back that day so that there might be time to consider what was best for all parties. Don Luis kissed his hands by force, nay, bathed them with his tears, in a way that would have touched a heart of marble, not to say that of the judge, who, as a shrewd man, had already perceived how advantageous the marriage would be to his daughter, though, were it possible, he would have preferred that it should be brought about with the consent of the father of Don Luis, who he knew looked for a title for his son. The guests had by this time made peace with the landlord, for, by persuasion and Don Quixote's fair words more than by threats, they had paid him what he demanded, and the servants of Don Luis were waiting for the end of the conversation with the judge and their master's decision, when the devil, who never sleeps, contrived that the barber, from whom Don Quixote had taken Mambrino's helmet and Sancho Panza the trappings of his ass in exchange for those of his own, should at this instant enter the inn, which said barber, as he led his ass to the stable, observed Sancho Panza engaged in repairing something or other belonging to the pack saddle, and the moment he saw it he knew it, and made bold to attack Sancho, exclaiming, Ho, sir thief, I have caught you. Hand over my basin and my pack saddle, and all my trappings that you robbed me of. Sancho, finding himself so unexpectedly assailed, and hearing the abuse poured upon him, seized the pack saddle with one hand, and with the other gave the barber a cuff that bathed his teeth in blood. The barber, however, was not so ready to relinquish the prize he had made in the pack saddle. On the contrary, he raised such an outcry that everyone in the inn came running to know what the noise and quarrel meant. Here, in the name of the king and justice, he cried, this thief and highwayman wants to kill me for trying to recover my property. You lie, said Sancho, I am no highwayman, it was in fair war my master Don Quixote won these spoils. Don Quixote was standing by at the time, highly pleased to see his squire's stoutness, both offensive and defensive, and from that time forth he reckoned him a man of mettle, and in his heart resolved to dub him a knight on the first opportunity that presented itself, feeling sure that the order of chivalry would be fittingly bestowed upon him. In the course of the altercation, among other things the barber said, Gentlemen, this pack saddle is mine as surely as I owe God a death, and I know it as well as if I had given birth to it, and here is my ass in the stable who will not let me lie, only try it, and if it does not fit him like a glove, call me a rascal, and what is more, the same day I was robbed of this, they robbed me likewise of a new brass basin, never yet handselled, that would fetch a crown any day. At this Don Quixote could not keep himself from answering, and interposing between the two, and separating them, he placed the pack saddle on the ground, to lie there in sight until the truth was established, and said, Your worships may perceive clearly and plainly the error under which this worthy squire lies when he calls a basin which was, is, and shall be the helmet of Mambrino which I won from him in fair war, and made myself master of by legitimate and lawful possession. With the pack saddle I do not concern myself, but I may tell you on that head that my squire Sancho asked my permission to strip off the caparison of this vanquished poltroon steed, and with it adorn his own. I allowed him, and he took it, and as to its having been changed from a caparison into a pack saddle, I can give no explanation except the usual one, that such transformations will take place in adventures of chivalry. To confirm all which, run, Sancho my son, and fetch hither the helmet which this good fellow calls a basin. Egad, master, said Sancho, if we have no other proof of our case than what your worship puts forward, Mambrino's helmet is just as much a basin as this good fellow's caparison is a pack saddle. Do as I bid thee, said Don Quixote, it cannot be that everything in this castle goes by enchantment. Sancho hastened to where the basin was, and brought it back with him, and when Don Quixote saw it, he took hold of it and said, Your worships may see with what a face this squire can assert that this is a basin and not the helmet I told you of, and I swear by the order of chivalry I profess, that this helmet is the identical one I took from him, without anything added to or taken from it. There is no doubt of that, said Sancho, for from the time my master won it until now he has only fought one battle in it, when he let loose those unlucky men in chains, and if it had not been for this basin helmet he would not have come off over well that time, for there was plenty of stone throwing in that affair. Chapter 45. In which the doubtful question of Mambrino's helmet and the pack saddle is finally settled, with other adventures that occurred in truth and earnest. What do you think now, gentlemen, said the barber, of what these gentles say when they want to make out that this is a helmet? And whoever says the contrary, said Don Quixote, I will let him know he lies if he is a knight, and if he is a squire that he lies again 1,000 times. Our own barber, who was present at all this, and understood Don Quixote's humor so thoroughly, took it into his head to back up his delusion and carry on the joke for the general amusement, so addressing the other barber he said, Señor Barber, or whatever you are, you must know that I belong to your profession too, and have had a license to practice for more than 20 years, and I know the implements of the barber craft, every one of them, perfectly well, and I was likewise a soldier for some time in the days of my youth, and I know also what a helmet is, and a morion, and a headpiece with a visor, and other things pertaining to soldiering, I meant to say to soldiers' arms, and I say, saving better opinions and always with submission to sounder judgments, that this piece we have now before us, which this worthy gentleman has in his hands, not only is no barber's basin, but is as far from being one as white as from black, and truth from falsehood. I say, moreover, that this, although it is a helmet, is not a complete helmet. Certainly not, said Don Quixote, for half of it is wanting, that is to say the beaver. It is quite true, said the curate, who saw the object of his friend the barber, and Cardenio, Don Fernando and his companions agreed with him, and even the judge, if his thoughts had not been so full of Don Luis's affair, would have helped to carry on the joke, but he was so taken up with the serious matters he had on his mind that he paid little or no attention to these facetious proceedings. God bless me, exclaimed there but the barber at this, is it possible that such an honorable company can say that this is not a basin but a helmet? Why, this is a thing that would astonish a whole university, however wise it might be. That will do, if this basin is a helmet, why, then the pack saddle must be a horse's caparison, as this gentleman has said. To me it looks like a pack saddle, said Don Quixote, but I have already said that with that question I do not concern myself. As to whether it be pack saddle or caparison, said the curate, it is only for Señor Don Quixote to say, for in these matters of chivalry all these gentlemen and I bow to his authority. By God, gentlemen, said Don Quixote, so many strange things have happened to me in this castle on the 2 occasions on which I have sojourned in it, that I will not venture to assert anything positively in reply to any question touching anything it contains, for it is my belief that everything that goes on within it goes by enchantment. The first time, an enchanted Moor that there is in it gave me sore trouble, nor did Sancho fare well among certain followers of his, and last night I was kept hanging by this arm for nearly 2 hours, without knowing how or why I came by such a mishap. So that now, for me to come forward to give an opinion in such a puzzling matter, would be to risk a rash decision. As regards the assertion that this is a basin and not a helmet I have already given an answer, but as to the question whether this is a pack saddle or a caparison I will not venture to give a positive opinion, but will leave it to your worship's better judgment. Perhaps as you are not dubbed knights like myself, the enchantments of this place have nothing to do with you, and your faculties are unfettered, and you can see things in this castle as they really and truly are, and not as they appear to me. There can be no question, said Don Fernando on this, but that Señor Don Quixote has spoken very wisely, and that with us rests the decision of this matter, and that we may have surer ground to go on, I will take the votes of the gentlemen in secret, and declare the result clearly and fully. To those who were in on the secret of Don Quixote's humor all this afforded great amusement, but to those who knew nothing about it, it seemed the greatest nonsense in the world, in particular to the 4 servants of Don Luis, as well as to Don Luis himself, and to 3 other travelers who had by chance come to the inn, and had the appearance of officers of the Holy Brotherhood, as indeed they were, but the one who above all was at his wits' end was the barber whose basin, there before his very eyes, had been turned into Mombrino's helmet, and whose pack-saddle he had no doubt whatever was about to become a rich caparison for a horse. All laughed to see Don Fernando going from one to another collecting the votes, and whispering to them to give him their private opinion whether the treasure over which there had been so much fighting was a pack-saddle or a caparison. But after he had taken the votes of those who knew Don Quixote, he said aloud, "The fact is, my good fellow, that I am tired collecting such a number of opinions, for I find that there is not one of whom I ask what I desire to know, who does not tell me that it is absurd to say that this is the pack-saddle of an ass, and not the caparison of a horse, nay, of a thoroughbred horse. So you must submit, for, in spite of you and your ass, this is a caparison and no pack-saddle, and you have stated and proved your case very badly." "May I never share heaven," said the poor barber, "if your worships are not all mistaken, and may my soul appear before God as that appears to me a pack-saddle and not a caparison. But, laws go, I say no more, and indeed I am not drunk, for I am fasting, except it be from sin." The simple talk of the barber did not afford less amusement than the absurdities of Don Quixote, who now observed, "There is no more to be done now than for each to take what belongs to him, and to whom God has given it, may St. Peter add his blessing." But said one of the 4 servants, "Unless, indeed, this is a deliberate joke, I cannot bring myself to believe that men so intelligent as those present are, or seem to be, can venture to declare and assert that this is not a basin, and that not a pack-saddle. But as I perceive that they do assert and declare it, I can only come to the conclusion that there is some mystery in this persistence in what is so opposed to the evidence of experience and truth itself. For I swear by," and here he rapped out a round oath, "all the people in the world will not make me believe that this is not a barber's basin and that a jackass's pack-saddle." "It might easily be a she-ass's," observed the curate. "It is all the same," said the servant, "that is not the point, but whether it is or is not a pack-saddle, as your worships say." On hearing this, one of the newly arrived officers of the Brotherhood, who had been listening to the dispute and controversy, unable to restrain his anger and impatience, exclaimed, "It is a pack-saddle as sure as my father is my father, and whoever has said or will say anything else must be drunk." "You lie like a rascally clown," returned Don Quixote, and lifting his pike, which he had never let out of his hand, he delivered such a blow at his head that, had not the officer dodged it, it would have stretched him at full length. The pike was shivered in pieces against the ground, and the rest of the officers, seeing their comrade assaulted, raised a shout, calling for help for the Holy Brotherhood. The landlord, who was of the fraternity, ran at once to fetch his staff of office and his sword, and ranged himself on the side of his comrades. The servants of Don Luis clustered round him, lest he should escape from them in the confusion. The barber, seeing the house turned upside down, once more laid hold of his pack-saddle, and Sancho did the same. Don Quixote drew his sword and charged the officers. Don Luis cried out to his servants to leave him alone and go and help Don Quixote, and Cardenio and Don Fernando, who were supporting him. The curate was shouting at the top of his voice, the landlady was screaming, her daughter was wailing, Maritornes was weeping, Dorothea was aghast, Lucinda terror-stricken, and Doña Clara in a faint. The barber cudgeled Sancho, and Sancho pommeled the barber. Don Luis gave one of his servants, who ventured to catch him by the arm to keep him from escaping, a cuff that bathed his teeth in blood. The judge took his part. Don Fernando had got one of the officers down and was belaboring him heartily. The landlord raised his voice again, calling for help for the Holy Brotherhood, so that the whole inn was nothing but cries, shouts, shrieks, confusion, terror, dismay, mishaps, sword cuts, fisticuffs, cudgellings, kicks, and bloodshed. And in the midst of all this chaos, complication, and general entanglement, Don Quixote took it into his head that he had been plunged into the thick of the discord of a Grammant's camp, and, in a voice that shook the inn like thunder, he cried out, "Hold all, let all sheathe their swords, let all be calm and attend to me as they value their lives." All paused at his mighty voice, and he went on to say, "Did I not tell you, sirs, that this castle was enchanted, and that a legion or so of devils dwelt in it? In proof whereof I call upon you to behold with your own eyes how the discord of a Grammant's camp has come hither, and been transferred into the midst of us. See how they fight, there for the sword, here for the horse, on that side for the eagle, on this for the helmet. We are all fighting, and all at cross purposes. Come then, you, Señor Judge, and you, Señor Curate, let the one represent King Agramant and the other King Sobrino, and make peace among us, for by God Almighty it is a sorry business that so many persons of quality as we are should slay one another for such trifling cause." The officers, who did not understand Don Quixote's mode of speaking, and found themselves roughly handled by Don Fernando, Cardenio, and their companions, were not to be appeased. The barber was, however, for both his beard and his pack saddle were the worse for the struggle. Sancho like a good servant obeyed the slightest word of his master, while the 4 servants of Don Luis kept quiet when they saw how little they gained by not being so. The landlord alone insisted upon it that they must punish the insolence of this madman, who at every turn raised a disturbance in the inn, but at length the uproar was stilled for the present. The pack saddle remained a caparison till the day of judgment, and the basin a helmet and the inn a castle in Don Quixote's imagination. All having been now pacified and made friends by the persuasion of the judge and the curate, the servants of Don Luis began again to urge him to return with them at once, and while he was discussing the matter with them, the judge took counsel with Don Fernando, Cardenio, and the curate as to what he ought to do in the case, telling them how it stood, and what Don Luis had said to him. It was agreed at length that Don Fernando should tell the servants of Don Luis who he was, and that it was his desire that Don Luis should accompany him to Andalusia, where he would receive from the Marquis his brother the welcome his quality entitled him to, for, otherwise, it was easy to see from the determination of Don Luis that he would not return to his father at present, though they tore him to pieces. On learning the rank of Don Fernando and the resolution of Don Luis, the 4 then settled it between themselves that 3 of them should return to tell his father how matters stood, and that the other should remain to wait upon Don Luis, and not leave him until they came back for him, or his father's orders were known. Thus by the authority of Agramant and the wisdom of King Sobrino all this complication of disputes was arranged, but the enemy of concord and hater of peace, feeling himself slighted and made a fool of, and seeing how little he had gained after having involved them all in such an elaborate entanglement, resolved to try his hand once more by stirring up fresh quarrels and disturbances. It came about in this wise: the officers were pacified on learning the rank of those with whom they had been engaged, and withdrew from the contest, considering that whatever the result might be they were likely to get the worst of the battle. But one of them, the one who had been thrashed and kicked by Don Fernando, recollected that among some warrants he carried for the arrest of certain delinquents, he had one against Don Quixote, whom the Holy Brotherhood had ordered to be arrested for setting the galley slaves free, as Sancho had, with very good reason, apprehended. Suspecting how it was, then, he wished to satisfy himself as to whether Don Quixote's features corresponded, and taking a parchment out of his bosom he lit upon what he was in search of, and setting himself to read it deliberately, for he was not a quick reader, as he made out each word he fixed his eyes on Don Quixote, and went on comparing the description in the warrant with his face, and discovered that beyond all doubt he was the person described in it. As soon as he had satisfied himself, folding up the parchment, he took the warrant in his left hand and with his right seized Don Quixote by the collar so tightly that he did not allow him to breathe, and shouted aloud, "Help for the Holy Brotherhood! And that you may see I demanded in earnest, read this warrant which says this highwayman is to be arrested." The curate took the warrant and saw that what the officer said was true, and that it agreed with Don Quixote's appearance, who, on his part, when he found himself roughly handled by this rascally clown, worked up to the highest pitch of wrath, and all his joints cracking with rage, with both hands seized the officer by the throat with all his might, so that had he not been helped by his comrades he would have yielded up his life ere Don Quixote released his hold. The landlord, who had perforce to support his brother officers, ran at once to aid them. The landlady, when she saw her husband engaged in a fresh quarrel, lifted up her voice afresh, and its note was immediately caught up by Maritornes and her daughter, calling upon heaven and all present for help, and Sancho, seeing what was going on, exclaimed, "By the Lord, it is quite true what my master says about the enchantments of this castle, for it is impossible to live an hour in peace in it." Don Fernando parted the officer and Don Quixote, and to their mutual contentment made them relax the grip by which they held, the one the coat collar, the other the throat of his adversary. For all this, however, the officers did not cease to demand their prisoner and call on them to help, and deliver him over bound into their power, as was required for the service of the king and of the Holy Brotherhood, on whose behalf they again demanded aid and assistance to effect the capture of this robber and footpad of the highways. Don Quixote smiled when he heard these words, and said very calmly, "Come now, base, ill-born brood, call ye it highway robbery to give freedom to those in bondage, to release the captives, to succor the miserable, to raise up the fallen, to relieve the needy? Infamous beings, who by your vile groveling intellects deserve that heaven should not make known to you the virtue that lies in knight-errantry, or show you the sin and ignorance in which ye lie when ye refuse to respect the shadow, not to say the presence, of any knight-errant. Come now, band, not of officers, but of thieves, footpads with the license of the Holy Brotherhood, tell me who was the ignoramus who signed a warrant of arrest against such a knight as I am? Who was he that did not know that knights errant are independent of all jurisdictions, that their law is their sword, their charter their prowess, and their edicts their will? Who, I say again, was the fool that knows not that there are no letters patent of nobility that confer such privileges or exemptions as a knight-errant acquires the day he is dubbed a knight, and devotes himself to the arduous calling of chivalry? What knight-errant ever paid poll tax, duty, queen's pin money, king's dues, toll or ferry? What tailor ever took payment of him for making his clothes? What castellan that received him in his castle ever made him pay his shot? What king did not seat him at his table? What damsel was not enamored of him and did not yield herself up wholly to his will and pleasure? And, lastly, what knight-errant has there been, is there, or will there ever be in the world, not bold enough to give, single-handed, 400 cudgellings to 400 officers of the Holy Brotherhood if they come in his way? Chapter 46. Of the end of the notable adventure of the officers of the Holy Brotherhood, and of the great ferocity of our worthy knight, Don Quixote. While Don Quixote was talking in this strain, the curate was endeavoring to persuade the officers that he was out of his senses, as they might perceive by his deeds and his words, and that they need not press the matter any further, for even if they arrested him and carried him off, they would have to release him by and by as a madman, to which the holder of the warrant replied that he had nothing to do with inquiring into Don Quixote's madness, but only to execute his superior's orders, and that once taken they might let him go 300 times if they liked. For all that, said the curate, you must not take him away this time, nor will he, it is my opinion, let himself be taken away. In short, the curate used such arguments, and Don Quixote did such mad things, that the officers would have been more mad than he was if they had not perceived his want of wits, and so they thought it best to allow themselves to be pacified, and even to act as peacemakers between the barber and Sancho Panza, who still continued their altercation with much bitterness. In the end they, as officers of justice, settled the question by arbitration in such a manner that both sides were, if not perfectly contented, at least to some extent satisfied, for they changed the pack saddles, but not the girths or headstalls, and as to Mombrino's helmet, the curate, under the rose and without Don Quixote's knowing it, paid 8 reals for the basin, and the barber executed a full receipt and engagement to make no further demand then or thenceforth forevermore. Amen. These 2 disputes, which were the most important and gravest, being settled, it only remained for the servants of Don Luis to consent that 3 of them should return while 1 was left to accompany him whither Don Fernando desired to take him, and good luck and better fortune, having already begun to solve difficulties and remove obstructions in favor of the lovers and warriors of the inn, were pleased to persevere and bring everything to a happy issue, for the servants agreed to do as Don Luis wished, which gave Doña Clara such happiness that no one could have looked into her face just then without seeing the joy of her heart. Zoraida, though she did not fully comprehend all she saw, was grave or gay without knowing why, as she watched and studied the various countenances, but particularly her Spaniards, whom she followed with her eyes and clung to with her soul. The gift and compensation which the curate gave the barber had not escaped the landlord's notice, and he demanded Don Quixote's reckoning, together with the amount of the damage to his wineskins, and the loss of his wine, swearing that neither Rocinante nor Sancho's ass should leave the inn until he had been paid to the very last farthing. The curate settled all amicably, and Don Fernando paid, though the judge had also very readily offered to pay the score, and all became so peaceful and quiet that the inn no longer reminded one of the discord of a Grammant's camp, as Don Quixote said, but of the peace and tranquility of the days of Octavianus, for all which it was the universal opinion that their thanks were due to the great zeal and eloquence of the curate, and to the unexampled generosity of Don Fernando. Finding himself now clear and quit of all quarrels, his squires as well as his own, Don Quixote considered that it would be advisable to continue the journey he had begun, and bring to a close that great adventure for which he had been called and chosen, and with this high resolve he went and knelt before Dorothea, who, however, would not allow him to utter a word until he had risen. So to obey her he rose, and said, "It is a common proverb, fair lady, that diligence is the mother of good fortune, and experience has often shown in important affairs that the earnestness of the negotiator brings the doubtful case to a successful termination, but in nothing does this truth show itself more plainly than in war, where quickness and activity forestall the devices of the enemy, and win the victory before the foe has time to defend himself. All this I say, exalted and esteemed lady, because it seems to me that for us to remain any longer in this castle now is useless, and may be injurious to us in a way that we shall find out some day, for who knows but that your enemy the giant may have learned by means of secret and diligent spies that I am going to destroy him, and if the opportunity be given him he may seize it to fortify himself in some impregnable castle or stronghold, against which all my efforts and the might of my indefatigable arm may avail but little. Therefore, lady, let us, as I say, forestall his schemes by our activity, and let us depart at once in quest of fair fortune, for your highness is only kept from enjoying it as fully as you could desire by my delay in encountering your adversary." Don Quixote held his peace and said no more, calmly awaiting the reply of the beauteous princess, who, with commanding dignity and a style adapted to Don Quixote's own, replied to him in these words: "I give you thanks, Sir Knight, for the eagerness you, like a good knight to whom it is a natural obligation to succor the orphan and the needy, display to afford me aid in my sore trouble, and heaven grant that your wishes and mine may be realized, so that you may see that there are women in this world capable of gratitude. As to my departure, let it be forthwith, for I have no will but yours. Dispose of me entirely in accordance with your good pleasure, for she who has once entrusted to you the defense of her person, and placed in your hands the recovery of her dominions, must not think of offering opposition to that which your wisdom may ordain." "On, then, in God's name," said Don Quixote, "for, when a lady humbles herself to me, I will not lose the opportunity of raising her up and placing her on the throne of her ancestors. Let us depart at once, for the common saying that in delay there is danger, lends spurs to my eagerness to take the road, and as neither heaven has created nor hell seen any that can daunt or intimidate me, saddle Rocinante, Sancho, and get ready thy ass and the queen's palfrey, and let us take leave of the castellan and these gentlemen, and go hence this very instant." Sancho, who was standing by all the time, said, shaking his head, "Ah! Master, master, there is more mischief in the village than one hears of, begging all good bodies pardon." "What mischief can there be at any village, or in all the cities of the world, you booby, that can hurt my reputation?" said Don Quixote. "If your worship is angry," replied Sancho, "I will hold my tongue and leave unsaid what as a good squire I am bound to say, and what a good servant should tell his master." "Say what thou wilt," returned Don Quixote, "provided thy words be not meant to work upon my fears, for thou, if thou fearest, art behaving like thyself, but I like myself, in not fearing." "It is nothing of the sort, as I am a sinner before God," said Sancho, "but that I take it to be sure and certain that this lady, who calls herself queen of the great kingdom of my Comicone, is no more so than my mother, for, if she was what she says, she would not go rubbing noses with one that is here every instant and behind every door." Dorothea turned red at Sancho's words, for the truth was that her husband Don Fernando had now and then, when the others were not looking, gathered from her lips some of the reward his love had earned, and Sancho seeing this had considered that such freedom was more like a courtesan than a queen of a great kingdom. She, however, being unable or not caring to answer him, allowed him to proceed, and he continued, "This I say, Señor, because, if after we have traveled roads and highways, and passed bad nights and worse days, one who is now enjoying himself in this inn is to reap the fruit of our labors, there is no need for me to be in a hurry to saddle Rocinante, put the pad on the ass, or get ready the palfrey, for it will be better for us to stay quiet, and let every jade mind her spinning, and let us go to dinner." Good God, what was the indignation of Don Quixote when he heard the audacious words of his squire! So great was it, that in a voice inarticulate with rage, with a stammering tongue, and eyes that flashed living fire, he exclaimed, "Rascally clown, boorish, insolent, and ignorant, ill-spoken, foul-mouthed, impudent backbiter and slanderer! Hast thou dared to utter such words in my presence and in that of these illustrious ladies? Hast thou dared to harbor such gross and shameless thoughts in thy muddled imagination? Begone from my presence, thou born monster, storehouse of lies, hoard of untruths, garner of knaveries, inventor of scandals, publisher of absurdities, enemy of the respect due to royal personages. Begone, show thyself no more before me under pain of my wrath." And so saying he knitted his brows, puffed out his cheeks, gazed around him, and stamped on the ground violently with his right foot, showing in every way the rage that was pent up in his heart. And at his words and furious gestures Sancho was so scared and terrified that he would have been glad if the earth had opened that instant and swallowed him, and his only thought was to turn round and make his escape from the angry presence of his master. But the ready-witted Dorothea, who by this time so well understood Don Quixote's humor, said, to mollify his wrath, "Be not irritated at the absurdities your good squire has uttered, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, for perhaps he did not utter them without cause, and from his good sense and Christian conscience it is not likely that he would bear false witness against anyone. We may therefore believe, without any hesitation, that since, as you say, Sir Knight, everything in this castle goes and is brought about by means of enchantment, Sancho, I say, may possibly have seen, through this diabolical medium, what he says he saw so much to the detriment of my modesty." "I swear by God Omnipotent," exclaimed Don Quixote at this, "your highness has hit the point, and that some vile illusion must have come before this sinner of a Sancho, that made him see what it would have been impossible to see by any other means than enchantments, for I know well enough, from the poor fellow's goodness and harmlessness, that he is incapable of bearing false witness against anybody." True, no doubt, said Don Fernando, for which reason, Señor Don Quixote, you ought to forgive him and restore him to the bosom of your favorite, sicut erat in principio, before illusions of this sort had taken away his senses. Don Quixote said he was ready to pardon him, and the curate went for Sancho, who came in very humbly, and falling on his knees begged for the hand of his master, who having presented it to him and allowed him to kiss it, gave him his blessing and said, Now, Sancho my son, thou wilt be convinced of the truth of what I have many a time told thee, that everything in this castle is done by means of enchantment. So it is, I believe, said Sancho, except the affair of the blanket, which came to pass in reality by ordinary means. Believe it not, said Don Quixote, for had it been so, I would have avenged thee that instant, or even now, but neither then nor now could I, nor have I seen anyone upon whom to avenge thy wrong. They were all eager to know what the affair of the blanket was, and the landlord gave them a minute account of Sancho's flights, at which they laughed not a little, and at which Sancho would have been no less out of countenance had not his master once more assured him it was all enchantment. For all that his simplicity never reached so high a pitch that he could persuade himself it was not the plain and simple truth, without any deception whatever about it, that he had been blanketed by beings of flesh and blood, and not by visionary and imaginary phantoms, as his master believed and protested. The illustrious company had now been 2 days in the inn, and as it seemed to them time to depart, they devised a plan so that, without giving Dorothea and Don Fernando the trouble of going back with Don Quixote to his village under pretense of restoring Queen Micomicona, the curate and the barber might carry him away with them as they proposed, and the curate be able to take his madness in hand at home, and in pursuance of their plan they arranged with the owner of an ox cart who happened to be passing that way to carry him after this fashion. They constructed a kind of cage with wooden bars, large enough to hold Don Quixote comfortably, and then Don Fernando and his companions, the servants of Don Luis, and the officers of the Brotherhood, together with the landlord, by the directions and advice of the curate, covered their faces and disguised themselves, some in one way, some in another, so as to appear to Don Quixote quite different from the persons he had seen in the castle. This done, in profound silence they entered the room where he was asleep, taking his rest after the past phrase, and advancing to where he was sleeping tranquilly, not dreaming of anything of the kind happening, they seized him firmly and bound him fast hand and foot, so that, when he awoke startled, he was unable to move, and could only marvel and wonder at the strange figures he saw before him, upon which he at once gave way to the idea which his crazed fancy invariably conjured up before him, and took it into his head that all these shapes were phantoms of the enchanted castle, and that he himself was unquestionably enchanted as he could neither move nor help himself, precisely what the curate, the concocter of the scheme, expected would happen. Of all that were there Sancho was the only one who was at once in his senses and in his own proper character, and he, though he was within very little of sharing his master's infirmity, did not fail to perceive who all these disguised figures were, but he did not dare to open his lips until he saw what came of this assault and capture of his master, nor did the latter utter a word, waiting to the upshot of his mishap, which was that bringing in the cage, they shut him up in it and nailed the bars so firmly that they could not be easily burst open. They then took him on their shoulders, and as they passed out of the room an awful voice, as much so as the barber, not he of the pack saddle but the other, was able to make it, was heard to say, O knight of the rueful countenance, let not this captivity in which thou art placed afflict thee, for this must needs be, for the more speedy accomplishment of the adventure in which thy great heart has engaged thee, the which shall be accomplished when the raging Manchegan lion and then the white Tabazan dove shall be linked together, having first humbled their haughty necks to the gentle yoke of matrimony. And from this marvelous union shall come forth to the light of the world brave whelps that shall rival the ravening claws of their valiant father, and this shall come to pass ere the pursuer of the flying nymph shall in his swift natural course have twice visited the starry signs. And thou, O most noble and obedient squire that ever bore sword at side, beard on face, or nose to smell with, be not dismayed or grieved to see the flower of knight-errantry carried away thus before thy very eyes, for soon, if it so please the framer of the universe, thou shalt see thyself exalted to such a height that thou shalt not know thyself, and the promises which thy good master has made thee shall not prove false, and I assure thee, on the authority of the sage Mentoroniana, that thy wages shall be paid thee, as thou shalt see in due season. Follow then the footsteps of the valiant enchanted knight, for it is expedient that thou shouldst go to the destination assigned to both of you, and as it is not permitted to me to say more, God be with thee, for I return to that place I wot of. And as he brought the prophecy to a close he raised his voice to a high pitch, and then lowered it to such a soft tone, that even those who knew it was all a joke were almost inclined to take what they heard seriously. Don Quixote was comforted by the prophecy he heard, for he at once comprehended its meaning perfectly, and perceived it was promised to him that he should see himself united in holy and lawful matrimony with his beloved Dulcinea del Toboso, from whose blessed womb should proceed the whelps, his sons, to the eternal glory of La Mancha. And being thoroughly and firmly persuaded of this, he lifted up his voice, and with a deep sigh exclaimed, O thou, whoever thou art, who hast foretold me so much good, I implore of thee that on my part thou entreat that sage enchanter who takes charge of my interests, that he leave me not to perish in this captivity in which they are now carrying me away, ere I see fulfilled promises so joyful and incomparable as those which have been now made me, for, let this but come to pass, and I shall glory in the pains of my prison, find comfort in these chains wherewith they bind me, and regard this bed whereon they stretch me, not as a hard battlefield, but as a soft and happy nuptial couch. And touching the consolation of Sancho Panza, my squire, I rely upon his goodness and rectitude that he will not desert me in good or evil fortune, for if, by his ill luck or mine, it may not happen to be in my power to give him the island I have promised, or any equivalent for it, at least his wages shall not be lost, for in my will, which is already made, I have declared the sum that shall be paid to him, measured, not by his many faithful services, but by the means at my disposal. Sancho bowed his head very respectfully and kissed both his hands, for, being tied together, he could not kiss one, and then the apparitions lifted the cage upon their shoulders and fixed it upon the ox cart. Chapter 47. Of the strange manner in which Don Quixote of La Mancha was carried away enchanted, together with other remarkable incidents. When Don Quixote saw himself caged and hoisted on the cart in this way, he said, Many grave histories of knights errant have I read, but never yet have I read, seen, or heard of their carrying off enchanted knights errant in this fashion, or at the slow pace that these lazy, sluggish animals promise, for they always take them away through the air with marvelous swiftness, enveloped in a dark thick cloud, or on a chariot of fire, or it may be on some hippogriff or other beast of the kind, but to carry me off like this on an ox cart. By God, it puzzles me. But perhaps the chivalry and enchantments of our day take a different course from that of those in days gone by, and it may be, too, that as I am a new knight in the world, and the first to revive the already forgotten calling of knight adventurers, they may have newly invented other kinds of enchantments and other modes of carrying off the enchanted. What thinkest thou of the matter, Sancho my son? I don't know what to think, answered Sancho, not being as well read as your worship in errant writings, but for all that I venture to say and swear that these apparitions that are about us are not quite Catholic. Catholic, said Don Quixote. Father of me! How can they be Catholic when they are all devils that have taken fantastic shapes to come and do this, and bring me to this condition? And if thou wouldst prove it, touch them, and feel them, and thou wilt find they have only bodies of air, and no consistency except in appearance. By God, master, returned Sancho, I have touched them already, and that devil, that goes about there so busily, has firm flesh, and another property very different from what I have heard say devils have, for by all accounts they all smell of brimstone and other bad smells, but this one smells of ember half a league off. Sancho was here speaking of Don Fernando, who, like a gentleman of his rank, was very likely perfumed as Sancho said. Marvel not at that, Sancho my friend, said Don Quixote, for let me tell thee devils are crafty, and even if they do carry odors about with them, they themselves have no smell, because they are spirits, or, if they have any smell, they cannot smell of anything sweet, but of something foul and fetid, and the reason is that as they carry hell with them wherever they go, and can get no ease whatever from their torments, and as a sweet smell is a thing that gives pleasure and enjoyment, it is impossible that they can smell sweet. If, then, this devil thou speakest of seems to thee to smell of amber, either that thou art deceiving thyself, or he wants to deceive thee by making thee fancy he is not a devil. Such was the conversation that passed between master and man, and Don Fernando and Cardenio, apprehensive of Sancho's making a complete discovery of their scheme, towards which he had already gone some way, resolved to hasten their departure, and calling the landlord aside, they directed him to saddle Rocinante and put the pack saddle on Sancho's ass, which he did with great alacrity. In the meantime the curate had made an arrangement with the officers that they should bear them company as far as his village, he paying them so much a day. Cardenio hung the buckler on one side of the bow of Rocinante's saddle and the basin on the other, and by signs commanded Sancho to mount his ass and take Rocinante's bridle, and at each side of the cart he placed 2 officers with their muskets, but before the cart was put in motion, out came the landlady and her daughter and Maritornes to bid Don Quixote farewell, pretending to weep with grief at his misfortune, and to them Don Quixote said, Weep not, good ladies, for all these mishaps are the lot of those who follow the profession I profess, and if these reverses did not befall me I should not esteem myself a famous knight-errant, for such things never happen to knights of little renown and fame, because nobody in the world thinks about them. To valiant knights they do, for these are envied for their virtue and valor by many princes and other knights who compass the destruction of the worthy by base means. Nevertheless, virtue is of herself so mighty, that, in spite of all the magic that Zoroaster, its first inventor, knew, she will come victorious out of every trial, and shed her light upon the earth as the sun does upon the heavens. Forgive me, fair ladies, if, through inadvertence, I have not offended you, for intentionally and wittingly I have never done so to any, and pray to God that he deliver me from this captivity to which some malevolent enchanter has consigned me, and should I find myself released therefrom, the favors that ye have bestowed upon me in this castle shall be held in memory by me, that I may acknowledge, recognize, and requite them as they deserve. While this was passing between the ladies of the castle and Don Quixote, the curate and the barber bade farewell to Don Fernando and his companions, to the captain, his brother, and the ladies, now all made happy, and in particular to Dorothea and Lucinda. They all embraced one another, and promised to let each other know how things went with them, and Don Fernando directed the curate where to write to him, to tell him what became of Don Quixote, assuring him that there was nothing that could give him more pleasure than to hear of it, and that he too, on his part, would send him word of everything he thought he would like to know, about his marriage, Zoraida's baptism, Don Luis's affair, and Lucinda's return to her home. The curate promised to comply with his request carefully, and they embraced once more, and renewed their promises. The landlord approached the curate and handed him some papers, saying he had discovered them in the lining of the valise in which the novel of the ill-advised curiosity had been found, and that he might take them all away with him as their owner had not since returned, for, as he could not read, he did not want them himself. The curate thanked him, and opening them he saw at the beginning of the manuscript the words, Novel of Rinconete and Cortadillo, by which he perceived that it was a novel, and as that of the ill-advised curiosity had been good he concluded this would be so too, as they were both probably by the same author, so he kept it, intending to read it when he had an opportunity. He then mounted and his friend the barber did the same, both masked, so as not to be recognized by Don Quixote, and set out following in the rear of the cart. The order of march was this: first went the cart with the owner leading it, at each side of it marched the officers of the Brotherhood, as has been said, with their muskets, then followed Sancho Panza on his ass, leading Rocinante by the bridle, and behind all came the curate and the barber on their mighty mules, with faces covered, as aforesaid, and a grave and serious air, measuring their pace to suit the slow steps of the oxen. Don Quixote was seated in the cage, with his hands tied and his feet stretched out, leaning against the bars as silent and as patient as if he were a stone statue and not a man of flesh. Thus slowly and silently they made, it might be, 2 leagues, until they reached a valley which the carter thought a convenient place for resting and feeding his oxen, and he said so to the curate, but the barber was of opinion that they ought to push on a little farther, as at the other side of a hill which appeared close by he knew there was a valley that had more grass and much better than the one where they proposed to halt, and his advice was taken and they continued their journey. Just at that moment the curate, looking back, saw coming on behind them 6 or 7 mounted men, well found and equipped, who soon overtook them, for they were traveling, not at the sluggish, deliberate pace of oxen, but like men who rode cannon's mules, and in haste to take their noontide rest as soon as possible at the inn which was in sight not a league off. The quick travelers came up with the slow and courteous salutations were exchanged, and one of the newcomers, who was, in fact, a canon of Toledo and master of the others who accompanied him, observing the regular order of the procession, the cart, the officers, Sancho, Rocinante, the curate and the barber, and above all Don Quixote caged and confined, could not help asking what was the meaning of carrying the man in that fashion, though, from the badges of the officers, he already concluded that he must be some desperate highwayman or other malefactor whose punishment fell within the jurisdiction of the Holy Brotherhood. One of the officers to whom he had put the question, replied, "Let the gentleman himself tell you the meaning of his going this way, Señor, for we do not know." Don Quixote overheard the conversation and said, "Haply, gentlemen, you are versed and learned in matters of errant chivalry? Because if you are I will tell you my misfortunes, if not, there is no good in my giving myself the trouble of relating them." But here the curate and the barber, seeing that the travelers were engaged in conversation with Don Quixote, came forward, in order to answer in such a way as to save their stratagem from being discovered. The canon, replying to Don Quixote, said, "In truth, brother, I know more about books of chivalry than I do about Villalpando's elements of logic, so if that be all, you may safely tell me what you please." "In God's name, then, Señor," replied Don Quixote, "if that be so, I would have you know that I am held enchanted in this cage by the envy and fraud of wicked enchanters, for virtue is more persecuted by the wicked than loved by the good. I am a knight-errant, and not one of those whose names fame has never thought of immortalizing in her record, but of those who, in defiance and in spite of envy itself, and all the magicians that Persia, or Brahmins that India, or gymnosophists that Ethiopia ever produced, will place their names in the temple of immortality, to serve as examples and patterns for ages to come, whereby knights errant may see the footsteps in which they must tread if they would attain the summit and crowning point of honor in arms. What Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha says, observe the curate, is the truth, for he goes enchanted in this cart, not from any fault or sins of his, but because of the malevolence of those to whom virtue is odious and valor hateful. This, Señor, is the Knight of the Rueful Countenance, if you have ever heard him named, whose valiant achievements and mighty deeds shall be written on lasting brass and an imperishable marble, notwithstanding all the efforts of envy to obscure them and malice to hide them. When the canon heard both the prisoner and the man who was at liberty talk in such a strain, he was ready to cross himself in his astonishment, and could not make out what had befallen him, and all his attendants were in the same state of amazement. At this point Sancho Panza, who had drawn near to hear the conversation, said, in order to make everything plain, well, sirs, you may like or dislike what I am going to say, but the fact of the matter is, my master, Don Quixote, is just as much enchanted as my mother. He is in his full senses, he eats and he drinks, and he has his calls like other men and as he had yesterday, before they caged him. And if that's the case, what do they mean by wanting me to believe that he is enchanted? For I have heard many a one say that enchanted people neither eat, nor sleep, nor talk, and my master, if you don't stop him, will talk more than 30 lawyers. Then turning to the curate he exclaimed, ah, Señor Curate, do you think I don't know you? Do you think I don't guess and see the drift of these new enchantments? Well then, I can tell you I know you, for all your face is covered, and I can tell you I am up to you, however you may hide your tricks. After all, where envy reigns virtue cannot live, and where there is niggardliness there can be no liberality. Ill betide the devil. If it had not been for your worship my master would be married to the princess my Comicona this minute, and I should be a count at least, for no less was to be expected, as well from the goodness of my master, him of the rueful countenance, as from the greatness of my services. But I see now how true it is what they say in these parts, that the wheel of fortune turns faster than a mill wheel, and that those who were up yesterday are down today. I am sorry for my wife and children, for when they might fairly and reasonably expect to see their father return to them a governor or viceroy of some island or kingdom, they will see him come back a horseboy. I have said all this, Señor Curate, only to urge your paternity to lay to your conscience your ill treatment of my master, and have a care that God does not call you to account in another life for making a prisoner of him in this way, and charge against you all the succors and good deeds that my lord Don Quixote leaves undone while he is shut up. Trim those lamps there, exclaimed the barber at this, so you are of the same fraternity as your master, too, Sancho? By God, I begin to see that you will have to keep him company in the cage, and be enchanted like him for having caught some of his humor and chivalry. It was an evil hour when you let yourself be got with child by his promises, and that island you longed so much for found its way into your head. I am not with child by anyone, returned Sancho, nor am I a man to let myself be got with child, if it was by the king himself. Though I am poor I am an old Christian, and I owe nothing to nobody, and if I long for an island, other people long for worse. Each of us is the son of his own works, and being a man I may come to be pope, not to say governor of an island, especially as my master may win so many that he will not know whom to give them to. Mind how you talk, Master Barber, for shaving is not everything, and there is some difference between Peter and Peter. I say this because we all know one another, and it will not do to throw false dice with me, and as to the enchantment of my master, God knows the truth, leave it as it is, it only makes it worse to stir it. The barber did not care to answer Sancho lest by his plain speaking he should disclose what the curate and he himself were trying so hard to conceal, and under the same apprehension the curate had asked the canon to ride on a little in advance, so that he might tell him the mystery of this man in the cage, and other things that would amuse him. The canon agreed, and going on ahead with his servants, listened with attention to the account of the character, life, madness, and ways of Don Quixote, given him by the curate, who described to him briefly the beginning and origin of his craze, and told him the whole story of his adventures up to his being confined in the cage, together with the plan they had of taking him home to try if by any means they could discover a cure for his madness. The canon and his servants were surprised anew when they heard Don Quixote's strange story, and when it was finished he said, "To tell the truth, Señor Curate, I for my part consider what they call books of chivalry to be mischievous to the state, and though, led by idle and false taste, I have read the beginnings of almost all that have been printed, I never could manage to read any one of them from beginning to end, for it seems to me they are all more or less the same thing, and one has nothing more in it than another, this no more than that. And in my opinion this sort of writing and composition is of the same species as the fables they call the Milesian, nonsensical tales that aim solely at giving amusement and not instruction, exactly the opposite of the apologue fables which amuse and instruct at the same time. And though it may be the chief object of such books to amuse, I do not know how they can succeed, when they are so full of such monstrous nonsense. For the enjoyment the mind feels must come from the beauty and harmony which it perceives or contemplates in the things that the eye or the imagination brings before it, and nothing that has any ugliness or disproportion about it can give any pleasure. What beauty, then, or what proportion of the parts to the whole, or of the whole to the parts, can there be in a book or fable where a lad of 16 cuts down a giant as tall as a tower and makes two halves of him as if he was an almond cake? And when they want to give us a picture of a battle, after having told us that there are 1,000,000 of combatants on the side of the enemy, let the hero of the book be opposed to them, and we have perforce to believe, whether we like it or not, that the said knight wins the victory by the single might of his strong arm. And then, what shall we say of the facility with which a born queen or empress will give herself over into the arms of some unknown wandering knight? What mind, that is not wholly barbarous and uncultured, can find pleasure in reading of how a great tower full of knights sails away across the sea like a ship with a fair wind, and will be tonight in Lombardy and tomorrow morning in the land of Prester John of the Indies, or some other that Ptolemy never described nor Marco Polo saw? And if, in answer to this, I am told that the authors of books of the kind write them as fiction, and therefore are not bound to regard niceties of truth, I would reply that fiction is all the better the more it looks like truth, and gives the more pleasure the more probability and possibility there is about it. Plots in fiction should be wedded to the understanding of the reader, and be constructed in such a way that, reconciling impossibilities, smoothing over difficulties, keeping the mind on the alert, they may surprise, interest, divert, and entertain, so that wonder and delight joined may keep pace one with the other, all which he will fail to effect who shuns verisimilitude and truth to nature, wherein lies the perfection of writing. I have never yet seen any book of chivalry that puts together a connected plot complete in all its numbers, so that the middle agrees with the beginning, and the end with the beginning and middle. On the contrary, they construct them with such a multitude of members that it seems as though they meant to produce a chimera or monster rather than a well-proportioned figure. And besides all this, they are harsh in their style, incredible in their achievements, licentious in their amours, uncouth in their courtly speeches, prolix in their battles, silly in their arguments, absurd in their travels, and, in short, wanting in everything like intelligent art, for which reason they deserve to be banished from the Christian commonwealth as a worthless breed. The curate listened to him attentively and felt that he was a man of sound understanding, and that there was good reason in what he said, so he told him that, being of the same opinion himself, and bearing a grudge to books of chivalry, he had burned all Don Quixote's, which were many, and gave him an account of the scrutiny he had made of them, and of those he had condemned to the flames and those he had spared, with which the canon was not a little amused, adding that though he had said so much in condemnation of these books, still he found one good thing in them, and that was the opportunity they afforded to a gifted intellect for displaying itself, for they presented a wide and spacious field over which the pen might range freely, describing shipwrecks, tempests, combats, battles, portraying a valiant captain with all the qualifications requisite to make one, showing him sagacious in foreseeing the wiles of the enemy, eloquent in speech to encourage or restrain his soldiers, ripe in counsel, rapid in resolve, as bold in biding his time as in pressing the attack, now picturing some sad tragic incident, now some joyful and unexpected event, here a beauteous lady, virtuous, wise, and modest, there a Christian knight, brave and gentle, here a lawless, barbarous braggart, there a courteous prince, gallant and gracious, setting forth the devotion and loyalty of vassals, the greatness and generosity of nobles. Or again, said he, the author may show himself to be an astronomer, or a skilled cosmographer, or musician, or one versed in affairs of state, and sometimes he will have a chance of coming forward as a magician if he likes. He can set forth the craftiness of Ulysses, the piety of Aeneas, the valor of Achilles, the misfortunes of Hector, the treachery of Sinon, the friendship of Euryalus, the generosity of Alexander, the boldness of Caesar, the clemency and truth of Trajan, the fidelity of Zopyrus, the wisdom of Cato, and in short all the faculties that serve to make an illustrious man perfect, now uniting them in one individual, again distributing them among many, and if this be done with charm of style and genius invention, aiming at the truth as much as possible, he will assuredly weave a web of bright and varied threads that, when finished, will display such perfection and beauty that it will attain the worthiest object any writing can seek, which, as I said before, is to give instruction and pleasure combined, for the unrestricted range of these books enables the author to show his powers, epic, lyric, tragic, or comic, and all the moods the sweet and winning arts of poesy and oratory are capable of, for the epic may be written in prose just as well as in verse.
英語聞き流しリスニング、英語テキストと MP3 ダウンロード、その他の物語はホームページからお聞きいただけます。88thpp.com 88thpp.com